It started with a faint sound, something I could easily dismiss as the house settling or the wind rattling a loose shingle. I had always lived in older houses, and strange noises at night were nothing new to me. But this was different, subtle, persistent, and almost too quiet to notice at first. It was late, well past midnight, and the house was still. The kind of stillness that makes every creak and groan seem amplified. I was lying in bed, the blankets pulled up to my chin, trying to drift off to sleep when I heard it. A soft, shuffling noise like something, or someone, moving above me in the attic. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was just the wind or maybe a squirrel that had somehow gotten inside. But the more I listened, the clearer it became. It wasn't the random, scurrying sound of an animal. It was deliberate, slow, as if something was pacing back and forth across the attic floor. I sat up in bed, my heart starting to beat a little faster. The attic had always been a place I rarely visited. It was cramped, dusty, filled with old boxes and forgotten memories. The only time I ever went up there was to store things I didn't need anymore, and even then, I never stayed longer than necessary. It wasn't that I was scared of the attic, exactly, but it had always felt off, in a way I couldn't quite explain. I lay back down, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. But the noise continued, growing louder, more distinct. I could hear the creak of the wooden beams, the soft thud of something heavy being dragged across the floor. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. Was someone up there? Had someone broken into the house and was hiding in the attic? The thought sent a shiver down my spine, and I found myself reaching for my phone, ready to call the police. But something held me back, a nagging feeling that maybe I was overreacting. Instead, I got out of bed and grabbed the small flashlight I kept on my nightstand. I figured I'd go up and take a quick look, just to put my mind at ease. After all, it was probably nothing. Maybe a box had fallen over, or a loose beam was causing the noise. Whatever it was, I needed to see it for myself. I crept down the hallway, trying to make as little noise as possible. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft patter of my bare feet on the hardwood floor. When I reached the door to the attic, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The shuffling sound was louder now, more distinct. It was definitely coming from the attic, and there was no mistaking it for the wind or an animal. I took a deep breath and opened the door. The hinges creaked loudly, and I winced, hoping I hadn't alerted whatever, or whoever, was up there. The narrow staircase leading up to the attic was steep and shadowy, the faint light from my flashlight barely piercing the darkness. I climbed slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, the sound of my own breathing loud in my ears. When I reached the top, I stood there for a moment, listening. The shuffling had stopped, and the attic was silent, the kind of silence that feels almost tangible, pressing in from all sides. I shone the flashlight around the space, the beam cutting through the thick dust that hung in the air. The attic was just as I remembered it, cramped, cluttered, filled with old boxes and furniture draped in sheets. Everything was exactly as it should be, and for a moment, I felt a wave of relief. Maybe I had imagined the noise, or maybe it had been something perfectly innocent, like a gust of wind. I was about to turn and head back downstairs when I saw it. In the far corner of the attic, half hidden behind a stack of boxes, was a small old trunk that I didn't recognize. It was odd because I was sure I had never seen it before. The trunk was made of dark wood, the surface scratched and worn with age, and the metal fittings were tarnished and rusted. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached the trunk cautiously. As I got closer, I noticed something else. The floor around the trunk was scuffed, as if it had been dragged across the floor recently. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. Someone had been up here, and they had moved this trunk. I knelt down and hesitated, my hand hovering over the lid. The shuffling noise I had heard earlier echoed in my mind, and for a brief moment, I considered turning around and leaving the attic, locking the door behind me, and pretending none of this had ever happened. But I had come this far, and I couldn't leave without knowing what was inside. With a deep breath, I opened the trunk. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. The inside of the trunk was lined with old yellowed fabric, and on top of it, nestled carefully, was a collection of photographs. They were black and white, faded with age, and as I picked one up, I realized they were all of the same person. A little girl no older than 6 or 7, with long dark hair and a solemn expression. I rifled through the photographs, my hands trembling. There were dozens of them, all of the same girl, taken in various places, inside a house, outside in a garden, standing in front of a school. The girl never smiled, never looked directly at the camera. There was something unsettling about her, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. As I reached the bottom of the pile, I found something even more disturbing, a small handwritten note, the ink smudged and the paper brittle with age. The handwriting was neat and precise, but the words sent a chill down my spine. She never left. I stared at the note, my mind racing. What did that mean? Who was this girl, and why were these photographs hidden in my attic? I felt a deep sense of unease, as if I had uncovered something that was never meant to be found. Before I could think too much about it, the shuffling noise started again, louder this time, closer. My heart leapt into my throat as I realized it was coming from directly above me, from the ceiling of the attic. I looked up, the flashlight beam trembling in my hand. The ceiling was low and covered in cobwebs, the wooden beams exposed and dusty. But then I saw it. A small square hatch in the ceiling, a piece of wood that looked like it could be pushed aside to reveal a crawlspace. The shuffling continued, louder now, as if something was moving around just above the hatch. I stood frozen, my mind screaming at me to run, to get out of the attic and lock the door behind me. But I couldn't move, couldn't tear my eyes away from the hatch. And then, slowly, the hatch began to open. A pale, slender hand emerged, pushing the hatch aside with a soft creak. I backed away, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps, as the hand was followed by an arm, then a shoulder, and finally, a head. It was the girl from the photographs. Her hair was long and dark, tangled and matted with dirt, and her skin was deathly pale. Her eyes were wide, hollow, and staring straight at me. She moved with a jerky, unnatural motion, pulling herself out of the crawlspace and into the attic, her feet dragging across the floor as she stood upright. She didn't speak, didn't make a sound. She just stared at me with those empty, lifeless eyes, her expression blank and unreadable. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to tear my eyes away from her. She took a step toward me, then another, her movements slow and deliberate. I stumbled backward, tripping over a stack of boxes and falling to the floor. The flashlight rolled out of my hand, the beam spinning wildly around the attic, casting strange, distorted shadows on the walls. The girl was getting closer, her face inches from mine, and I could feel the cold, clammy air that surrounded her. Her eyes bored into mine, and I felt a deep, overwhelming sense of dread, as if I was staring into the abyss itself. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went dark. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor of the attic, the morning light filtering through the small, grimy window. The hatch in the ceiling was closed, the trunk was gone, and the attic was silent. But I knew, deep down, that something had changed. The house felt different, colder, as if it was no longer just a house but something else entirely, something that was waiting for me. I never went back into the attic. I never told anyone what happened that night. But every now and then, in the dead of night, I hear the shuffling noise again, faint but unmistakable, coming from above. And I know that she's still there, waiting, just beyond the hatch, in the darkness. It started on a Tuesday evening, just as the sun was beginning to set and the light in the sky took on that strange, in-between quality. I had been working late, trying to finish up a project that had been hanging over my head for weeks. My apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that creeps in when you've been alone too long. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards as the building settled. I was sitting at my desk, staring at the computer screen when something caught my eye. A flicker of movement, just outside the edge of my vision. I turned my head and looked out the window across from my desk, the one that faced the building next door. That's when I saw him. My neighbor was standing at his window, directly across from mine, just a few feet away. He was staring straight at me, his face illuminated by the dim light from inside his apartment. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, his hands at his sides, his gaze fixed on me. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. Maybe he had just happened to glance out his window at the same moment I did. But then I noticed something strange. He was smiling. It wasn't a friendly smile, the kind you give when you make eye contact with someone. It was a slow, deliberate smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was as if he knew something I didn't, something that made him happy in a way that sent a chill down my spine. I forced myself to look away, shaking off the unsettling feeling that had settled in my stomach. I tried to focus on my work, but I couldn't help glancing back at the window every few minutes. Each time he was still there, still staring, still smiling. He hadn't moved an inch. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe he was just zoning out, lost in thought, and it only seemed like he was staring at me. But as the minutes ticked by, it became harder to convince myself of that. There was something unnatural about the way he was standing, so perfectly still, his eyes never wavering from mine. I decided to close the blinds. I stood up, walked over to the window, and pulled them down, shutting out the sight of him. But even as the blinds snapped into place, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, watching me from the other side. That night, I tried to forget about it. I made dinner, watched TV, did all the normal things I usually did to unwind after a long day. But the image of my neighbor, standing there, smiling at me through the window, wouldn't leave my mind. When I finally went to bed, I lay there for what felt like hours, unable to sleep, my thoughts racing. The next morning, I was almost able to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, or maybe I had been more tired than I realized. But as the day went on, I started to dread the moment when I would have to sit down at my desk again, the moment when I would have to look out that window. When evening came, I couldn't bring myself to pull up the blinds. Instead, I sat in the dark, the only light coming from the glow of my computer screen. I worked in silence, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease that gnawed at the edges of my mind. But eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I reached out, my hand trembling slightly, and lifted the edge of the blind, just enough to peek outside. My heart skipped a beat. He was still there. My neighbor was standing in the exact same spot, in the exact same position, staring directly at me. His smile had widened, stretching his lips into a grotesque grin that bared his teeth. He looked almost inhuman, as if his face had been stretched too tight, the smile carved into his features. I jerked back from the window, my heart racing. This wasn't normal. No one stood in one place for hours, staring at someone else's window, smiling like that. I tried to tell myself that there had to be some logical explanation, but deep down I knew there wasn't. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind outside, made me jump. I kept the blinds closed, but I could feel him out there, his eyes boring into me through the thin fabric. I didn't know what to do. Call the police? What would I say? My neighbor is staring at me? They'd think I was crazy. The next day I decided to confront him. I couldn't live like this, couldn't let this creep invade my life like this. So I waited until evening, when I knew he would be at the window, and I forced myself to look out. There he was, exactly as I had expected, still staring, still smiling. But this time, I didn't shy away. I held his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. I marched out of my apartment and crossed the hall, knocking on his door with more force than necessary. There was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time, the sound echoing through the empty hallway. Still nothing. I tried the doorknob, but it was locked. I don't know what compelled me to do it, but I walked back to my apartment, grabbed the spare key that I had for some reason, probably left behind by the previous tenant, and went back to his door. My hands were shaking as I unlocked it and pushed the door open. The apartment was dark, the air stale and heavy. I hesitated at the threshold, but the silence inside was overwhelming, pressing me to move forward. I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. The place was eerily quiet, and as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized it was almost empty. There was no furniture, no decorations, nothing that suggested someone had been living there, just bare walls and dusty floors. I moved toward the window where I had seen him standing. There was no one there. I checked the entire apartment, but it was completely deserted. The only thing I found was a single photograph lying on the floor by the window. I picked it up, my hands trembling. It was a picture of me, taken from the same angle as his window, staring out of my own window. My face was pale, my eyes wide with fear, just like they had been the first night I saw him. I dropped the photo and backed out of the apartment, slamming the door behind me. I ran back to my own apartment, locking the door and drawing the blinds shut as tightly as I could. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, and my mind was racing with thoughts I couldn't control. I tried to rationalize what I had seen, tried to make sense of it, but nothing added up. The apartment had been empty. There was no way he could have been there, no way he could have been staring at me night after night. I spent the rest of the night in a state of panic, jumping at every sound, convinced that he was still out there, watching me. When the sun finally rose, I felt a small sense of relief, but it was fleeting. The fear never really went away. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't focus on anything, couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time I looked at the window, I imagined him standing there, his smile wide and empty. I avoided going outside, avoided the hallway where his apartment was. I was trapped in my own home, a prisoner of my own fear. Then one night, as I was lying in bed, I heard a soft tapping on the window. My heart nearly stopped. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat, and saw the blinds moving slightly, as if someone was brushing their fingers against them. I bolted out of bed and ran to the living room, but the tapping followed me. No matter where I went, the sound was there, always just behind me, always just out of sight. I knew what it was. I knew he was back. I grabbed my phone and called the police, my voice trembling as I tried to explain what was happening. They arrived within minutes, but by then, the tapping had stopped and the apartment was silent. The officers searched the building, but they found nothing. No sign of anyone else in my apartment, no sign of my neighbor. They checked the empty apartment next door, the one where I had seen him, but it was still empty, just as it had been before. They assured me that there was nothing to worry about, that I was safe, but I knew better. The next night, the tapping started again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. I could hear it coming from all sides, as if it was surrounding me, closing in on me. I tried to block it out, tried to ignore it, but it was relentless. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was deafening, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe, afraid of what might happen next. Slowly, I turned toward the window, and my blood ran cold. The blinds were open, and there he was, standing outside, looking in at me, his smile wider than ever, his eyes darker than the night. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him, in the shadows, I could see other figures, their faces twisted into the same unnatural grins, their eyes locked on mine. They were all there, all staring, all smiling, as if they had been waiting for this moment. I backed away, my mind screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The room seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing longer, darker, until they swallowed me whole. And as the darkness consumed me, I realized the truth. I had never been alone. They had been watching me all along, waiting for the moment when I would finally see them for what they really were. Now I am one of them, trapped in the shadows, smiling out at the world through the glass, waiting, watching for the next person who dares to look out their window and see what's really there. It had been a long day at work, the kind of day that drains the life out of you, leaving you exhausted and numb. By the time I got on the subway, my body felt heavy, my eyelids even heavier. I found a seat in the corner of the train car, slumped into it, and let the gentle rocking of the subway lull me into a doze. I didn't intend to fall asleep, but I guess the fatigue caught up with me. The rhythmic clattering of the wheels on the tracks, the distant murmur of conversations, and the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, all of it blurred into a soothing white noise that pulled me under. When I woke up, it was with a start. My eyes snapped open, and for a moment I was disoriented, not sure where I was or what time it was. The train was still moving, but something felt off, like the atmosphere had changed while I slept. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The train car, which had been filled with people just moments ago, or had it been hours, was now almost empty. There were a few passengers left, but they sat far apart, each one hunched over in their seats, staring blankly ahead. The usual noise, the chatter, the rustling of newspapers was gone, replaced by a heavy, oppressive quiet. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the last remnants of sleep, and looked around. The lights inside the car flickered occasionally, casting odd shadows that seemed to stretch and shift in the corners of my vision. I couldn't quite place it, but the light itself seemed different, dimmer, colder. I glanced at the digital display above the doors, the one that showed the next station. The letters were flickering, glitching in and out of focus, but I couldn't read the name. It wasn't one I recognized. The train slowed to a stop, and the doors slid open with a soft hiss. I looked outside, expecting to see a familiar station, but what I saw instead sent a shiver down my spine. The platform was there, but it was wrong. The walls were covered in old, crumbling tiles, many of them cracked or missing entirely. Faded, peeling posters from decades ago hung limply on the walls, their colors washed out and the images barely recognizable. The lights on the platform were dim, flickering erratically, casting long, distorted shadows. But it wasn't just the station that was wrong, it was the people. A few figures stood on the platform, waiting to board, but they didn't look right. Their clothes were outdated, like something from a different era, and their faces were pale, almost gray, with dark, hollow eyes that stared straight ahead, unblinking. I felt a deep, primal fear settle in my gut. Something was very wrong. I wanted to get off the train, to get out of this nightmare, but my body wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, trapped in my seat as the strange figures shuffled onto the train, their movements stiff and unnatural. They took seats around the car, but they didn't sit like normal people. They perched on the edges of the seats, their backs ramrod straight, their hands resting unnaturally still in their laps. No one spoke, no one even acknowledged my presence. It was as if I didn't exist to them. The train doors slid shut, and with a lurch, the subway began to move again. I glanced around, hoping for some sign of normalcy, but everything felt wrong. The air in the car was thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. The windows were dark, offering no view of the outside world, just a black void rushing past. I reached for my phone, desperate to check the time, to see if I had somehow overslept and ended up on the wrong train, but when I pulled it out, the screen was dead. No matter how many times I pressed the power button, it wouldn't turn on. The panic in my chest grew stronger, my heart pounding in my ears. I needed to get off this train. The next station, whatever it was, couldn't come soon enough. I stood up, my legs shaky, and moved toward the doors, but as I did, I felt all eyes on me. The passengers, those strange, silent figures, turned their heads in unison, their hollow eyes locking onto me. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. They were watching me, their faces expressionless, their eyes dark and empty. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin as I backed away, returning to my seat. The moment I sat down, they turned away, resuming their vacant stares. The train continued to move, the minutes stretching into an eternity. I kept glancing at the display, but the letters and numbers flickered and glitched, offering no clue as to where I was or where I was going. I was trapped in this surreal, nightmarish journey with no way to escape. Finally, the train began to slow, and I braced myself as the doors slid open once more. The platform outside was just as decayed as the last one, but this time, there were no figures waiting to board. The station was completely empty, the silence even more oppressive than before. I stood up again, determined to leave this time, to get out of this strange, twisted subway system and back to the world I knew. But as I stepped toward the door, the lights in the car flickered and went out completely, plunging everything into darkness. For a moment, I was completely blind, the only sound the faint hum of the train's engine and the blood pounding in my ears. Then, slowly, the lights came back on, dimmer than before, casting long, eerie shadows across the car. When I looked around, my heart skipped a beat. The passengers, the strange, silent figures were gone. The car was empty, except for me. The train sat motionless, the doors wide open, but the platform outside was no longer a subway station. It was something else entirely. The walls were cracked and crumbling, the floor covered in dirt and debris. Old, rusted machinery lay scattered around, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. I stepped off the train, my feet crunching on the loose gravel. The air was cold, and a thick fog hung low to the ground, obscuring everything beyond a few feet in front of me. The only sound was the faint dripping of water somewhere in the distance. I turned to look back at the train, but as soon as I did, the doors slid shut with a final, echoing hiss. The lights inside flickered one last time before going out completely, and the train began to move, slowly at first, then picking up speed as it disappeared into the darkness of the tunnel. I was alone. The platform stretched out in both directions, disappearing into the fog, but there was no sign of an exit, no stairs, no signs, nothing to indicate where I was or how to get out. The silence was deafening, pressing in on me from all sides. I started walking, my footsteps echoing in the empty space, but no matter how far I went, the platform seemed to stretch on endlessly, the fog never lifting. The sense of dread that had been gnawing at me since I woke up on the train grew stronger with each step. And then I saw them. Figures emerging from the fog, their forms indistinct at first, but growing clearer as they approached. They were the passengers from the train, those same hollow-eyed figures with their pale gray skin and unnatural smiles. They moved toward me in perfect unison, their movements slow and deliberate, their eyes fixed on me. I turned and ran, but the fog closed in around me, disorienting me, twisting the platform into a maze of endless corridors. No matter which way I turned, they were there, always just out of sight, always watching, always waiting. Finally, I stumbled into a dead end, the walls closing in on me, the fog thickening until I could barely see my own hands in front of me. The figures were there, surrounding me, their empty eyes staring into mine, their smiles wide and unnatural. I backed up against the wall, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was no escape. They moved closer, their eyes never leaving mine, their whispers filling the air, a low, droning hum that drowned out all other sound. And then everything went black. When I opened my eyes again, I was back on the train, the same dim, flickering lights overhead, the same quiet hum of the engine. But this time I wasn't alone. The figures were there, sitting in the seats around me, their hollow eyes staring blankly ahead. The train was moving, the world outside the windows a blur of darkness, and I knew, with a sinking feeling of dread, that there was no way out. The train would keep moving, the stations would keep changing, but I would never leave. I was trapped in this endless, nightmarish journey, with nothing but the empty stares of the passengers to keep me company. And as the train plunged deeper into the darkness, I realized that I had become one of them. I woke up with a start, the cold leather of the car seat sticking to my skin. My head was pounding, a dull, persistent ache that made it hard to think clearly. The first thing I noticed was the dark, heavy silence around me, broken only by the faint hum of the engine. I was in my car, the dashboard dimly lit by the soft glow of the instruments, but nothing outside the windows was visible in the darkness. Panic surged through me as I realized I had no memory of how I had gotten here. The last thing I remembered was leaving work late, the familiar routine of locking up the office and heading to my car. But everything after that was a blur, like a dream slipping through my fingers. I reached up and touched the side of my head, wincing as my fingers brushed over a tender spot near my temple. There was no blood, but the pain was sharp, almost electric. I tried to piece together the fragments of my memory, but nothing made sense. Why was I in the car? Where was I going? I glanced at the dashboard again, hoping for some clue. The fuel gauge was low, the needle hovering just above empty. I must have been driving for a while, but the GPS screen was blank, offering no hint of my location. I flicked on the headlights, and the beams cut through the darkness, revealing a narrow, winding road surrounded by dense woods. The trees loomed tall and menacing, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out the sky. The sight of the road filled me with unease. I didn't recognize it, and there were no signs, no landmarks to tell me where I was. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly into the night, a twisting path leading who knows where. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white, as I tried to steady my breathing. I had to figure out what was happening, how I had ended up here, but the more I thought about it, the more my mind felt like it was spiraling out of control. a whirlwind of fear and confusion. I took a deep breath and forced myself to calm down. I needed to keep moving, to find a way out of this nightmare. I put the car in gear and started driving, the tires crunching over the gravel as I pulled back onto the road. The forest closed in around me, the headlights casting eerie shadows that danced among the trees. Every now and then I caught glimpses of movement in the corner of my eye, fleeting shapes that vanished as soon as I tried to focus on them. I told myself it was just the wind, the branches swaying in the breeze, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing mile. I kept driving, my eyes straining to see through the darkness. The road twisted and turned, taking me deeper into the woods, and the sense of disorientation grew stronger. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, but the display was frozen, the numbers stuck at 12:03. It felt like time itself had stopped, like I was trapped in some endless loop with no way out. Then, out of nowhere, the engine sputtered and died. The car coasted to a stop, and I was left in the suffocating silence of the forest, the headlights flickering and then going out completely. I tried turning the key in the ignition, but the engine wouldn't start. The only sound was the soft ticking of the cooling engine and my own ragged breathing. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, paralyzed by fear. The darkness pressed in on all sides, the trees seeming to move closer, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. I knew I couldn't stay in the car, but the thought of stepping out into the night filled me with dread. But I had no choice. I couldn't just sit here and wait for something to happen. I grabbed my phone from the passenger seat, but there was no signal, the screen showing only the mocking words, "No service." I shoved it back into my pocket and took a deep breath, steeling myself for whatever was out there. I pushed open the car door, the creak of the hinges unnaturally loud in the stillness. The cold night air hit me like a wave, and I shivered as I stepped out onto the road. The darkness was absolute, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon, barely visible through the thick canopy of trees. I started walking, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The gravel crunched under my shoes, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. I kept glancing over my shoulder, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing behind me, only the empty road stretching out into the darkness. After what felt like hours, I saw a faint light up ahead. My heart leapt with hope, and I quickened my pace, the light growing brighter as I approached. It was coming from a small cabin, nestled among the trees on the side of the road. The windows were dark, but the front porch was illuminated by a single flickering lantern, casting long shadows across the ground. I hesitated at the edge of the clearing, something about the cabin feeling off, like it didn't belong here. But I had no other options. I needed help, needed answers. I stepped forward, my feet crunching on the gravel as I made my way to the front door. I reached out and knocked, the sound echoing through the night. There was no answer, no movement from inside. I knocked again, louder this time, but the only response was the creaking of the wind through the trees. I tried the door, and to my surprise, it swung open easily, revealing a dark, empty interior. The air inside was cold, and the smell of damp wood and mildew was overpowering. I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under my weight, and looked around. The cabin was small, a single room with a fireplace, a table, and a few chairs. The only other door led to what I assumed was a small bedroom or storage area. I called out, but my voice sounded hollow in the empty space. There was no one here. The light from the lantern outside barely penetrated the darkness, casting strange, distorted shadows on the walls. The unease that had been building inside me turned to full-blown panic, and I turned to leave. But then I saw it, something on the floor near the fireplace. I stepped closer, my heart pounding, and the beam of my flashlight fell on a bundle of old clothes, crumpled and stained. As I crouched down to get a better look, I noticed something else, a small, faded photograph lying among the clothes. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and held it up to the light. The photograph was old, the edges yellowed and curling, but the image was clear enough. It showed a young boy standing in front of the very cabin I was in, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes wide with fear. There was something familiar about him, something that tugged at the edges of my memory, but I couldn't quite place it. And then I realized with a jolt of terror, The boy in the photograph was me. I dropped the picture, stumbling back in shock. How could that be? I didn't remember this place, didn't remember anything about this nightmarish cabin or the photograph. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing closer, the shadows growing darker and more menacing. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the windows. I ran to the door, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped, and then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from behind the door to the other room. My heart raced as I turned to face it, the sound growing louder, more insistent. I backed away, my hands shaking as the door slowly creaked open. A figure stepped out of the darkness, the same boy from the photograph, but now he was older, his face twisted with anger and pain. He stared at me with those same hollow eyes, and as he stepped closer, I saw the truth. The boy was me, or rather, what I had become. I tried to speak, to plead, but no words came out. The figure raised a hand, pointing at me, his mouth moving silently as if he were trying to tell me something I didn't want to hear. And then the lights went out, plunging the cabin into complete darkness. The last thing I felt was a cold hand gripping my shoulder, pulling me down into the void. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness, and then there was nothing. No one ever found the car, the cabin, or me. I was lost, trapped in the shadows of a night that never ended, a forgotten memory in a place that should never have existed. And somewhere out there in the darkness, the other me is still waiting, still watching, for the next person who dares to find the path to the old cabin in the woods.